In the dense pine forests of northern Mississippi, where humidity hangs in the air like a wet blanket and Spanish moss drapes from ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, there's a story that most historians refuse to touch. In 1836, a traveling preacher named Josiah Bennett and his 10-year-old twin daughters, Sarah and Susanna, arrived at a small Baptist community called Hebron Springs. The town was so isolated that most maps didn't even bother marking it. Just 150 souls living in the middle of nowhere, bound together by strict religious doctrine and something else, something they never talked about. What happened during the Bennett family's 4-day visit was documented in excruciating detail by Reverend Marcus Thornton, the community's pastor. His journal sat hidden in a family attic for over a century before being discovered in 1954. The entries describe events so precise, so unnaturally accurate, that modern psychologists still can't explain them. The Bennett twins didn't just predict things. They revealed secrets buried for years. They described people they'd never met. They spoke about a tragedy that happened before they were born. And here's the thing that makes this story so disturbing. Every single detail they revealed proved to be absolutely, verifiably true. But it's not just what they knew, it's how they knew it. Two 10-year-old girls who had never set foot in Mississippi somehow possessed knowledge that no living person should have had access to. Knowledge about a family that died in what everyone called an accident. Knowledge about where bodies were really buried. Knowledge that would destroy a community's carefully constructed lies. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And if this is your first time here, subscribe, because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about the limits of human consciousness. This isn't a ghost story. This is something stranger, something real, something that happened in 1836 and still has no rational explanation. So here's what happened in Hebron Springs, Mississippi. And I'm warning you now, some mysteries don't have comfortable answers. Hebron Springs wasn't much to look at in 1836. The community sat in a valley between two ridges of pine-covered hills, about 40 miles from any real town. Getting there meant following dirt roads that turned to impassable mud whenever it rained. And in Mississippi, it rained a lot. The settlement had been established in 1828 by 3 families, the Thorntons, the Carswells, and the Meachams. They were strict Baptists who'd left a larger congregation down near Natchez because they thought the church there was getting too liberal, too worldly. They wanted to worship God their way, without anyone telling them they were wrong. By 1836, those 3 families had grown to about 20 households. Most people were related by blood or marriage. Everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least they thought they did. The community centered around a simple wooden church built with their own hands. White-painted boards, a small bell tower, rough-hewn pews inside. Reverend Marcus Thornton, son of one of the founding families, served as pastor. He was a serious man, 38 years old, with dark hair that was already going grey at the temples. Marcus kept meticulous records of everything: births, deaths, marriages, baptisms, church attendance, even the weather. His journals filled shelf after shelf in his small study. This habit of documentation would prove crucial when the impossible started happening. The town itself was unremarkable. A general store run by the Carswell family, a blacksmith shop, a small mill by the creek, houses scattered through the valley, most of them simple log cabins with vegetable gardens out back. But there was something off about Hebron Springs. Travelers who passed through, and there weren't many, often commented on how quiet the place was. Not peaceful quiet, tense quiet, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something. The community had a reputation in the surrounding areas. People whispered about them, said they were unfriendly, secretive, that they didn't welcome outsiders and didn't like questions. And they were right, because Hebron Springs was hiding something. Something that happened 8 years before the Bennett family arrived. Something that the entire community had agreed to never speak about again. In the winter of 1828, during the settlement's first year, the Whitmore family had died in what everyone called a tragic accident. Thomas Whitmore had been a carpenter, a good one. He'd helped build most of the houses in Hebron Springs, including the church itself. His wife, Elena, was known for her beautiful singing voice. Their twin daughters, Grace and Hope, were 6 years old when they died. The official story was simple. On December 15, 1828, a fire broke out in the Whitmore cabin during the night. The family had been asleep. By the time neighbors saw the flames and came running, it was too late. The cabin burned to the ground with all 4 Whitmores inside. The community buried them in the church cemetery. 4 simple wooden crosses, a short funeral service. Reverend Thornton's father, who was the pastor back then, spoke about the mysterious ways of God and the importance of accepting divine will even when tragedy struck. And then everyone moved on. Or they tried to. But here's what visitors to Hebron Springs noticed over the years: nobody talked about the Whitmores. Ever. If you mentioned them, conversations stopped. People changed the subject. It was like the family had never existed. The spot where their cabin had stood remained empty. Nobody built there. Children avoided playing near it. And sometimes, late at night, some people claimed they could still smell smoke in that part of the valley, even 8 years later. The truth about what really happened to the Whitmore family was known to about 15 people in Hebron Springs: the community leaders, the founding families, people who had been there from the beginning. They carried that truth like a lead weight. It showed in their faces, in the way they wouldn't quite meet each other's eyes during church services, in the nightmares some of them still had. But they had all agreed the secret would stay buried. Until two 10-year-old girls arrived and started talking about things they couldn't possibly know. Josiah Bennett was a familiar sight along the circuit of remote churches scattered through Mississippi and Alabama. Tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and prematurely gray hair, he walked from town to town with his 2 daughters, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel containing his Bible and a few personal items. He'd been widowed for 10 years. His wife, Martha, had died giving birth to the twins during a cholera outbreak that swept through their hometown. The sickness had taken her 3 days after Sarah and Susanna were born. Josiah had been left alone with 2 infant daughters and a broken heart. But instead of becoming bitter, he turned to God. He started traveling, preaching at small churches that couldn't afford a full-time pastor. The work didn't pay much, usually just meals and a place to sleep, but it gave his life meaning, and it allowed him to raise his daughters in what he considered a righteous way. Sarah and Susanna Bennett were remarkable children. Identical in appearance, with pale blonde hair and striking green eyes, they moved and spoke with a synchronization that made people uncomfortable. They often finished each other's sentences. They seemed to communicate without words, and they had a way of looking at you that felt like they could see right through to your bones. But it wasn't just their twin connection that made them unusual. From a very young age, they demonstrated knowledge they shouldn't have possessed. Small things at first. Sarah would mention that a pastor's wife was worried about her sick mother, even though the woman hadn't told anyone her mother was ill. Susanna would ask about a family's lost cow and describe exactly where it had wandered off to, even though she'd never been to that town before. As they got older, their insights became more specific, more impossible to explain. In one town, they told a church deacon about money he'd stolen from the collection plate. In another, they described a hidden affair between 2 supposedly faithful congregation members. In yet another, they'd revealed that a respected elder had lied about his military service during the War of 1812. Word spread quickly through the circuit churches. Some preachers welcomed the Bennetts, believing the girls had a gift from God. Others refused to let them visit, calling them witches or worse. Josiah himself was conflicted. He loved his daughters. He knew they weren't evil. But he also knew their knowledge came from somewhere he couldn't explain or control. He'd learned to recognize the signs when the girls were about to reveal something. They'd grow very quiet. Their eyes would go distant, unfocused. They'd hold hands, their identical faces taking on an expression of deep concentration. And then one of them would speak, usually Sarah, with Susanna adding details that Sarah missed. It was like they were reading from a book, only they could see. Josiah had tried to understand it. He'd consulted with doctors, scholars, other preachers. Nobody could explain it. The most common theory was that the girls had inherited some form of second sight from their mother, who'd been known to have occasional premonitions. But Martha's abilities had been vague feelings, hunches about the future. What Sarah and Susanna experienced was completely different. They didn't predict the future. They revealed the past and present, things that had already happened, things that were currently happening, secrets that people thought were safely hidden. And they were never wrong. Not once. In November of 1836, Josiah received a letter from Reverend Marcus Thornton of Hebron Springs. The letter was polite but formal. The community had heard about Josiah's ministry and would appreciate a visit if he had time to spare. Something about the letter felt off to Josiah. The wording was too careful, too controlled, like the Reverend was choosing every word with extreme precision. But Josiah needed the work, and Hebron Springs was on his usual circuit route. He wrote back accepting the invitation. 3 weeks later, on a cold November morning, Josiah and his daughters began the long walk to Hebron Springs. They didn't know it yet, but they were walking into a situation that would challenge everything Josiah thought he understood about his daughter's abilities. And they were about to expose secrets that a community had killed to protect. The Bennett family arrived in Hebron Springs on November 18, 1836, just as the sun was setting behind the western ridge. The walk from the main road had taken longer than expected. The recent rains had turned the last 2 miles into a muddy obstacle course. Susanna had twisted her ankle on a hidden route, and Josiah had to carry her for the final stretch. They were exhausted, soaked from crossing a swollen creek, and hungry. Reverend Marcus Thornton met them at the edge of town. He was a stern-looking man with dark eyes that didn't quite match his welcoming smile. His handshake was firm, but his palm was sweating despite the cold. "Brother Bennett," he said, his voice carefully measured, "welcome to Hebron Springs. I trust your journey was without incident." "Long but manageable," Josiah replied. "My daughters and I appreciate your hospitality." Thornton's eyes flicked to Sarah and Susanna, who stood close together, holding hands. Their identical green eyes studied him with an intensity that made him shift his weight uncomfortably. "Of course," Thornton said, "we've prepared accommodations for you at the church. It's humble but dry and warm." As they walked through the town toward the church, Sarah and Susanna were unusually quiet. Normally, they'd chatter about their surroundings, pointing out interesting trees or asking questions about the buildings they passed. But tonight, they were silent. Josiah noticed. He also noticed how the few townspeople they encountered reacted to his daughters. An elderly woman crossing the road actually stopped and stared, her hand going to her mouth. A man standing outside the general store watched them pass with narrowed eyes, his jaw clenched tight. The church stood on a small hill at the center of town. In the fading light, it looked almost severe. The white paint gleamed like bone. The bell tower cast a long shadow across the cemetery behind it. That's when Sarah spoke for the first time since entering Hebron Springs. "The ground is angry here," she said quietly. Thornton stopped walking. "I beg your pardon." "She didn't mean anything," Josiah said quickly, putting a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. "She's tired from the journey." But Susanna was staring at the cemetery, her small face pale. "They're not resting," she whispered. "They want people to know." Thornton's welcoming smile had completely vanished. "Know what?" Sarah turned to look directly at him, about the fire that wasn't really a fire. The color drained from Thornton's face. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The wind rattled through the bare branches of the trees. Finally, Thornton cleared his throat. "Let's get you settled," he said, his voice tight. "We can talk more tomorrow." But as they followed him into the church, Josiah saw Thornton's hands trembling as he fumbled with the key. His daughters had struck a nerve. And Josiah had learned over the years that when Sarah and Susanna struck a nerve on the first day, things were about to get very complicated very quickly. The accommodations at the church were simple but adequate. A small room behind the sanctuary with 2 cots, a wash basin, and a fireplace that Thornton quickly got burning. He brought them bread, cheese, and cold chicken from his own home, along with a pitcher of water. "Services are at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning," he said from the doorway, avoiding eye contact with the twins. "I'll introduce you to the congregation then. Sleep well." He left quickly, his footsteps echoing through the empty church. After they'd eaten and Josiah had checked Susanna's ankle, it was swollen but not broken. The girls sat together on one of the cots. They'd changed into their nightgowns and braided each other's hair, their movements synchronized like a practiced dance. "Papa," Sarah said quietly, "this is a bad place." Josiah set down the Bible he'd been reading. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "The dreams started 2 nights ago," Susanna explained. "When we were still on the road, we both had them." This wasn't unusual. The girls often dreamed about the places they were going to visit, but something in their voices made Josiah uneasy. "What did you dream?" he asked. Sarah and Susanna exchanged one of their meaningful looks. Then Sarah spoke. "We dreamed about a cabin burning, but it wasn't just burning, Papa. Someone locked the door first. The family inside couldn't get out. We heard them screaming," Susanna continued. "A man, a woman, and 2 little girls. They begged for help, but nobody came." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "We saw who locked the door. We saw them standing outside, watching it burn. And then we saw where they buried the truth." Josiah felt ice in his stomach. "Girls, these are just dreams. Nightmares. You're in a new place and..." They're buried under the church floor, Papa, Sarah interrupted. Right beneath where the altar stands. That's why the ground is angry. That's why they can't rest, Susanna added. Josiah knew better than to dismiss his daughter's dreams. Too many times they'd proven to be accurate, but this was different. This was an accusation of murder. Listen to me carefully, he said, keeping his voice low. If what you're dreaming is true, then we're dealing with people who have kept a terrible secret for years, people who might be dangerous. We know, the twins said in unison. Then we need to be very careful. Tomorrow at the service you don't say anything. You understand, nothing about fires or burials or dreams. We'll see how things unfold naturally. The girls nodded, but Josiah could see the burden in their eyes. They'd carry this knowledge until it was released. An experience had taught him that secrets this big never stayed hidden for long once his daughters arrived. That night, Josiah barely slept. He kept thinking about Reverend Thornton's reaction to Sarah's comment about the fire. The man had gone white as a sheet, and there was something else: fear. Not the normal discomfort people felt around the girls. Real, genuine fear. Around midnight, Josiah heard soft crying coming from the girls' cot. "What's wrong?" he asked gently. "They're so sad, Papa," Sarah whispered in the darkness. The little girls, Grace and Hope, they just wanted their mama. They didn't understand why the door wouldn't open. "And their parents tried so hard to save them," Susanna added, her voice breaking. "But the smoke came too fast. They died holding their daughters." Josiah got up and went to his girls, pulling them both into an embrace. They were trembling, and he realized they weren't just receiving information. They were experiencing it, feeling what those people felt as they died. "My grandmother used to say," Josiah told them softly, "that some truths are too heavy for one person to carry. That's why God gives them to people who can share the burden." "We don't want this gift anymore," Sarah whispered. "I know, sweetheart, I know." But they all knew it didn't work that way. The knowledge came whether they wanted it or not, and in the morning, Josiah would have to decide what to do with it. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the church windows, and somewhere in the darkness, Josiah could have sworn he smelled smoke. The church bell began ringing at 9:30 the next morning. By the time it stopped, families were already arriving, walking up the hill from their various homes scattered throughout the valley. Josiah watched them through the window as he helped his daughters get ready. The congregation was exactly what he'd expected: farmers and their families, dressed in their Sunday best, simple people with weathered faces and calloused hands. But there was something in the way they moved, a stiffness, like soldiers marching into battle rather than worshippers coming to praise God. Sarah and Susanna wore their matching blue dresses, their blonde hair neatly braided. They looked like any other 10-year-old girls, innocent and sweet, but Josiah could see the tension in their small shoulders. They knew what was coming. Reverend Thornton found them just before the service started. "Brother Bennett," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I thought it best if you and your daughters sat in the front pew. After my sermon, I'll call you up to say a few words about your ministry." "That's very kind," Josiah replied. Thornton's eyes flicked to the twins, then away. "Yes, well, we should take our seats. It's almost time." The church was surprisingly full. About 100 people packed into the small sanctuary, filling every pew. Josiah noticed that certain families sat together: the Thorntons, the Carswells, the Meachams, the founding families. They positioned themselves strategically, like they'd rehearsed it. And every single one of them kept glancing at Sarah and Susanna. The service started normally enough. Hymns were sung, prayers were offered, the collection plate was passed around. Thornton's sermon was about forgiveness, specifically about God's willingness to forgive even the worst sins if confession and repentance were sincere. Josiah found the topic choice interesting. About halfway through the sermon, he noticed his daughter's hands had found each other. They weren't looking at Reverend Thornton anymore. Instead, their eyes were fixed on a spot near the altar, the exact spot they'd mentioned the night before. Their breathing had synchronized. Their faces had taken on that distant, focused expression Josiah knew so well. They were seeing something. Thornton wrapped up his sermon and called Josiah to the front. As Josiah stood and walked to the pulpit, he felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on him. "Thank you, Reverend Thornton," Josiah began. "My daughters and I are grateful for your hospitality. We've traveled throughout Mississippi and Alabama, bringing God's word to communities like yours, isolated places where faith sustains people through hardship." He spoke for about 10 minutes, sharing stories from their travels, talking about the importance of strong communities built on truth and righteousness. He sat down, thinking that was the end of it. But then Sarah stood up. "Mr. Thornton," she said, her clear child's voice carrying through the silent church, "why is there a name carved under the third floorboard from the altar?" Thornton froze. "I don't know what you mean, child." "Grace Whitmore carved her name there," Susanna said, standing beside her sister. She was trying to leave a message. She knew what was happening. A ripple of shock went through the congregation. Several people gasped. An elderly woman in the back started crying. "Girls," Josiah said quietly, though he knew it was too late to stop what was coming. "The fire started around midnight," Sarah continued, her voice steady. "But it wasn't an accident. Someone poured lamp oil around the outside of the cabin first. They locked the door from the outside," Susanna added. "Thomas Whitmore tried to break through it, but the wood was too thick. He died trying to save his family." The church had gone completely silent. Even Thornton seemed unable to speak. "Elena Whitmore had a silver locket," Sarah said. "It had locks of hair from her daughters inside. She was wearing it when she died. If you dig beneath the altar, you'll find it. The locket survived the fire." "So did her bones," Susanna finished quietly, "and her husband's, and their daughters, because they weren't buried in the cemetery like everyone says. They're under this church." The silence that followed was deafening. Then all hell broke loose. 3 things happened simultaneously. A man in the back row jumped to his feet, shouting, "This is witchcraft. Those girls are possessed." An elderly woman fainted, her husband catching her before she hit the floor. And Reverend Marcus Thornton sank into his chair behind the pulpit, his face the color of ash. Josiah moved quickly to stand between his daughters and the increasingly agitated congregation. "Everyone please calm down," he said, raising his hands. "Let's not. How dare you bring these demons into our church?" A large man with a thick beard was advancing down the aisle. Josiah recognized him from earlier, one of the Carswell family, spouting lies about good Christian people. "They're not lies," Sarah said calmly, though her hand had found Josiah's. "And we're not demons, we're just telling you what we see." "What you see?" A woman stood up, her voice shaking with rage. "You weren't even born when the Whitmores died. You know nothing about it." "We know Thomas Whitmore discovered something," Susanna said. "Something about money that went missing. Money that was supposed to go to the church building fund." The woman's mouth snapped shut. "He found out it was stolen," Sarah continued, "by the same people who were supposed to be collecting it. He confronted them, demanded they confess and make it right." "But they couldn't confess," Susanna said, "because then everyone would know what they'd done, so they decided to solve the problem permanently." Another man stood up, older, with white hair and trembling hands. His voice cracked as he spoke. "This is insane. You're accusing respected members of this community of murder based on children's fantasies." "Not fantasies," Sarah said gently. "We know it's hard to hear, but Grace and Hope Whitmore, they want everyone to know what really happened. They've been waiting 8 years for someone to listen." At the mention of the daughters' names, several women in the congregation started crying. The elderly woman who had fainted earlier was being helped outside by her husband. Josiah looked at Reverend Thornton, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the last 5 minutes. "Reverend," Josiah said carefully, "is there any truth to what my daughters are saying?" Thornton opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "We need to talk, in private." "No," the bearded Carswell man shouted. "We don't need to talk about anything. These people need to leave, now." But an older woman in the front row had stood up. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady. "James Carswell, you shut your mouth. If there's even a chance that what these girls are saying is true, then we owe it to the Whitmores to find out." "Martha, don't be ridiculous." "My sister was Elena Whitmore's best friend," Martha continued, her voice gaining strength. "She never believed that fire was an accident. She said Elena was too careful, too smart, but everyone told her to accept God's will and move on. She died 2 years ago, still wondering what really happened." More people were standing now. Some looked angry, some looked scared, but others looked like they were finally allowing themselves to question something they'd always suspected, but never dared to voice. Reverend Thornton stood on shaky legs. "Everyone please, let's all take a breath and think rationally about this." "What's to think about?" James Carswell demanded. "You're going to let 2 little girls accuse our founding families of murder? Based on what? Dreams?" "Based on facts they couldn't possibly know," another voice called out. It was a younger man, maybe in his 30s. "I'm a physician. I've studied the limits of human knowledge. There's no natural way these children could know about Grace carving her name, or Alina's locket, or any of it, unless they're telling the truth, Martha finished. Sarah turned to face the congregation. We can prove it, she said simply. Dig beneath the altar. You'll find the Whitmore family's remains, and you'll find evidence of how they really died. Absolutely not, James Carswell said. We will not desecrate our church based on the ravings of. I'll do it. Everyone turned to look at the speaker. It was an elderly man, thin and bent with age, leaning heavily on a cane. Josiah didn't recognize him, but clearly everyone else did. The church had gone completely silent. The old man made his way slowly to the front. Each step seemed to pain him. When he reached the altar, he turned to face the congregation. My name is William Meacham, he said, his voice surprisingly strong for someone so frail. I'm 76 years old. I was one of the founding members of Hebron Springs, and I've carried a secret for 8 years that's been eating me alive. William, don't, Thornton said, but there was no force behind the words. I helped build this church, Meacham continued. Every board, every nail, and I helped decide where certain things should be buried, things we wanted to make sure would never be found. The congregation was absolutely still. You could hear people breathing. The Whitmore family didn't die in an accident, Meacham said. We killed them, not me directly, but I was there. I watched, and I helped hide what we did. Josiah felt his daughters squeeze his hands. Thomas Whitmore discovered that Jacob Thornton, Samuel Carswell, and Henry Meacham, my own brother, had been stealing from the church building fund for 2 years, William continued. Nearly $300, which was everything we'd collected to build this sanctuary. They'd been using it for their own purposes, planning to replace it slowly over time. But Thomas found the real account books. He confronted them, demanded they confess to everyone and pay it back. They begged him to stay quiet, promised to return every penny, but Thomas was a righteous man. He said the congregation deserved the truth. William paused, his eyes distant with memory. So they decided Thomas and his family had to be silenced. They waited until late December, when the winter weather would explain why a family might keep their fireplace burning hot through the night. They soaked the outside walls of the Whitmore cabin with lamp oil while the family slept. They locked the door and the windows from the outside, and then they set it on fire. Several women in the congregation were openly sobbing now. Elena woke up first, William said, his voice cracking. We could hear her screaming for help. Then Thomas trying to break down the door. Then the little girls crying for their mama. It lasted. God forgive us, it lasted almost 10 minutes before the smoke took them. He looked directly at Sarah and Susanna. You said Grace carved her name. She did. We found it when we were cleaning up. A desperate little girl trying to leave proof that she existed, that she mattered. And the bodies, the physician asked quietly. We couldn't bury them in the cemetery, William said. Too many questions if anyone ever examined the remains. The fire should have destroyed everything, but it didn't burn as completely as we'd hoped. So we buried them under where the church would be built. Under sacred ground, we told ourselves, like that made it better. William's legs seemed to give out. He sat heavily on the steps leading to the altar. We built this entire church over their grave, he said. Every Sunday for 8 years, we've worshipped God while standing on the bones of a family we murdered. And we told ourselves it was justified, that we were protecting the community, protecting the greater good. He looked up at Reverend Thornton. Your father was the one who actually locked the door, Marcus. Did you know that? He did it because he was the pastor, and he thought it would be less suspicious if he was the one to discover the accident the next morning. Thornton had gone white. I didn't know, he whispered. I swear I didn't know. You didn't want to know, William corrected gently. None of us wanted to know. We built our church, raised our families, went on with our lives, and we never talked about it, never acknowledged what we'd done. He turned his gaze to the congregation. But these children know. God sent them here to finally bring the truth into the light, and I, for one, am grateful. I'm too old to carry this weight anymore. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of people crying. Then Sarah spoke, her voice soft but clear. Grace and hope forgive you, Mr. Meacham. They forgive all of you. They just wanted someone to know they existed, to remember them properly. They said their mama's last words were a prayer, Susanna added. She prayed that God would forgive the people who did this, and she prayed that someday the truth would come out. William Meacham looked at the twins with wonder and grief. How do you know these things? He asked. How can you possibly know? Sarah and Susanna looked at each other, then back at the old man. We don't know how, they said together. We just do. The decision to excavate beneath the church floor didn't happen immediately. After William Meacham's confession, the church descended into chaos. Some people wanted to dig right away. Others insisted on waiting for proper authorities. A few still claimed the whole thing was a hoax, though their protests grew weaker as more people corroborated parts of William's story. Reverend Thornton, shaken to his core by the revelation about his father, stepped down from his position immediately. He said he needed time to process everything, to pray, to figure out how to move forward. The physician, Dr. Robert Hayes, took charge. He was one of the few people in Hebron Springs with any formal education, and he had no family connection to the founding families. He'd moved to the community just 3 years ago. "If we're going to do this," he said firmly, "we're going to do it properly, with witnesses, with documentation, and with respect for the dead." He organized a committee of people who hadn't been in Hebron Springs in 1828, younger members of the community who couldn't possibly be implicated in the crime. They would supervise the excavation and ensure everything was handled correctly. It took 2 days to prepare. In that time, Josiah and his daughters stayed in a cabin offered by Martha, the woman whose sister had been Alina Whitmore's friend. She fed them, made sure they were comfortable, and asked them gentle questions about their abilities. "Do you see dead people?" she asked Sarah one afternoon as they shelled peas together. "Not exactly," Sarah said thoughtfully. "It's more like, we see what happened to them, like watching something that already occurred, but we can feel what they felt, hear what they heard." "And we hear them too," Susanna added, "not like voices talking, more like impressions, feelings they want us to understand." "Does it hurt?" Martha asked softly. Both girls nodded. "Sometimes," Sarah admitted, "when the people died badly, when they were scared or in pain, we feel that too." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, children. That's a terrible burden for one so young." "Papa says God only gives burdens to people strong enough to carry them," Susanna said. "Do you believe that?" The twins were quiet for a moment, then Sarah spoke carefully. "We're trying to." On the morning of the 3rd day, Dr. Hayes assembled everyone in front of the church. About 50 people had gathered, some out of genuine concern, others out of morbid curiosity. "Before we begin," Hayes said, "I want to be clear about what we're looking for. According to Mr. Meacham's confession and the girls' statements, we should find the remains of 4 people beneath the altar. Thomas and Alina Whitmore, ages approximately 28 and 26 at time of death, and their daughters Grace and Hope, at age 6. He paused, letting that sink in. "We should also find evidence of how they died. If the fire story is true, the bones should show signs of heat damage. If Alina Whitmore was wearing a silver locket as described, we should find that as well. And if Grace carved her name into the floorboard, we'll find that first." Dr. Hayes had brought proper tools: crowbars, shovels, brushes for delicate work. He'd also brought a notebook to document everything they found. "Sarah," he said, turning to the twins, "you said the name was carved under the 3rd floorboard from the altar. Is that correct?" Sarah nodded, her small face serious. On the underside, she had to scratch it with something metal, maybe a nail she found. Dr. Hayes knelt down and carefully began prying up the 3rd floorboard. The wood was old and came up easier than expected. He turned it over, brushing away years of accumulated dust and dirt. Then he went completely still. "What is it?" someone called out. Hayes held up the board so everyone could see. Scratched into the underside, in crude but unmistakable letters, was a name: Grace. The crowd gasped. Several people made the sign of the cross. Martha started crying. "There's more," Hayes said, his voice tight. He pointed to smaller scratches below the name. "I scared," he read aloud. "Mama, help." The silence that followed was crushing. Josiah felt his daughters trembling beside him. "You were right to tell them," he whispered. "This needed to be found." Hayes set the board carefully aside. "Let's continue," he said, though his hands were shaking now. They removed more floorboards, creating an opening about 4 feet square directly in front of the altar. The earth beneath was hard-packed, undisturbed for years, but as they began to dig, it became clear that this dirt had been moved before. About 2 feet down, they found the first bone. Dr. Hayes carefully brushed away the soil around it. "Adult femur," he said clinically, though his voice wavered. "Female, based on the size and shape." They continued digging slowly, reverently. More bones emerged: skulls, ribs, small bones that could only belong to children. And the bones were wrong. "They're not burned," someone observed. If they died in a fire, the bones should show charring, discoloration. They're not burned because they didn't die in a fire, Dr. Hayes said grimly. Look at this. He held up one of the adult skulls. Even Josiah, with no medical training, could see the crack running along the back of it. Blunt force trauma, Hayes said. This person was struck in the head with significant force, hard enough to fracture the skull. He examined the other adult skull. Same here, different pattern but definite trauma. So they were murdered, Martha said, her voice hollow, before the fire. The fire was to cover it up, Hayes confirmed. But something went wrong. The bodies didn't burn completely, so the killers had to hide them another way. They kept digging. The excavation took hours. The crowd watching grew silent as the full scope of what they were witnessing became clear. 4 complete skeletons, 2 adults, 2 children, all buried together in an unmarked grave beneath the church where they'd worshipped and served. And then, as the sun began to set, they found the locket. It was tarnished black with age, but the silver was still visible beneath the corrosion. Dr. Hayes carefully opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were 2 small locks of blonde hair, perfectly preserved. Grace and Hope, he said softly. Their mother carried their hair over her heart. Martha stepped forward. May I? She took the locket gently, her tears falling onto the tarnished silver. Elena showed me this the week before she died. She'd just gotten it as an anniversary gift from Thomas. She was so proud of it. She looked up at Sarah and Susanna. How did you know about this? How could you possibly know? The twins looked at each other, then at the open grave. Elena showed us, Sarah said simply. In our dreams, she wanted someone to find it, to prove she was a real person, not just a name in a story. They were all real people, Susanna added, with lives and dreams and people who loved them. They just wanted to be remembered. William Meacham, who had been standing at the back of the crowd, slowly made his way forward. He looked down at the bones with an expression of profound grief. I'm so sorry, Thomas, he said quietly. I'm so sorry, Elena, Grace, Hope, we took everything from you. Your lives, your dignity, even your grave, and we lived with that lie for 8 years. He looked around at the assembled crowd. Some of you didn't know, you were too young or you moved here later, but some of you knew, you suspected, you chose to stay silent. An uncomfortable stirring went through certain members of the crowd. Jacob Thornton is dead now, William continued. Died 4 years ago without ever confessing what he did. Samuel Carswell and my brother Henry both passed 2 years back, took their secrets to the grave, or so they thought, but secrets like this don't stay buried forever. What happens now? Someone asked. Dr. Hayes closed his notebook. Now we document everything properly. We contact the territorial authorities. We investigate every aspect of this crime, even though the perpetrators are mostly dead, and we give the Whitmore family a proper burial. And we tell the truth, Martha added firmly. All of it to everyone, no more secrets, no more lies. Reverend Thornton, who had been conspicuously absent during the excavation, appeared at the edge of the crowd. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 3 days. I've been praying, he said, his voice raw, trying to understand how my father could do such a thing, how a man of God could murder family and then preach about righteousness every Sunday. He walked to the edge of the excavation and looked down at the bones. I never knew, I swear before God, I never knew, but I should have questioned, should have wondered why my father woke up screaming sometimes, why he drank alone in his study, why he couldn't look at the altar without his hands shaking. The signs were there, he continued, but I didn't want to see them. None of us wanted to see them. Sarah stepped forward and took his hand. The gesture was so simple, so childlike, that several people gasped. Your father was afraid, she said gently. He didn't want to do it. He cried afterward. We saw that too. But he still did it, Thornton said bitterly. Yes, Sarah agreed. He did, and that's something you'll have to learn to live with, but it doesn't have to define you. You can choose to be different. How? Thornton asked desperately. How do I move forward from this? It was Josiah who answered, by telling the truth, by helping give this family the justice they deserve, and by building something better on honest foundations. Dr. Hayes began organizing the careful removal and preservation of the remains. They would need to be examined more thoroughly, documented properly, before they could be laid to rest. As the crowd began to disperse, talking in hushed tones about what they'd witnessed, Josiah noticed his daughters had gone very quiet. Are you all right? He asked. They're peaceful now, Susanna said softly. Grace and Hope, Josiah clarified. Both girls nodded. They said thank you, Sarah added. They can rest now. Josiah gathered his daughter's clothes. You did a good thing here, he said. A hard thing, but a good thing. Will we have to do this in other places too? Susanna asked. The question hung in the air. Josiah didn't have a good answer. His daughter's abilities didn't seem to be going away. If anything, they were getting stronger, more specific, more undeniable. I don't know, he admitted, but whatever comes, we'll face it together. That night, for the first time since arriving in Hebron Springs, the twins slept peacefully. No nightmares, no visions of burning cabins or locked doors or children crying for help. The dead, it seemed, had finally gotten what they needed. But Josiah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering about the implications of what had just happened. His daughters had proven beyond any doubt that they possessed knowledge no living person should have. They described events from 8 years ago with perfect accuracy. They'd located evidence that had been deliberately hidden. The question wasn't whether their abilities were real anymore. The question was what those abilities meant about the nature of death, consciousness, and the possibility that the dead could somehow communicate with the living. And Josiah had no answers. Only more questions. The territorial authorities arrived 5 days after the excavation. News of what had been discovered in Hebron Springs had spread quickly. A United States Marshal named Thomas Crawford rode in with 2 deputies and a territorial judge named Harrison Walsh. They'd been investigating suspicious deaths in remote Mississippi communities for months, and the Whitmore case immediately caught their attention. Marshal Crawford was a serious man in his 40s, with steel-gray eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He set up a temporary office in the church and began interviewing everyone in Hebron Springs who'd been there in 1828. Dr. Hayes had preserved the Whitmore remains carefully, along with the physical evidence, the locket, the carved floorboard, even samples of the soil from the grave. Crawford examined everything with meticulous attention to detail. Dr. Hayes, he said after reviewing the medical examination, you're certain these skulls show evidence of deliberate trauma? Absolutely certain, Hayes confirmed. Both adult skulls have fracture patterns consistent with being struck by a heavy object. The children's skulls are intact, which suggests they died of smoke inhalation before the trauma occurred. So the adults were murdered. Then the fire was set to kill the children and cover the evidence. Hayes nodded grimly. That would be my professional assessment. Crawford turned to William Meacham, who sat in a chair looking frailer than ever. Mr. Meacham, you've confessed to being an accessory to murder. You understand that regardless of your age, you can be prosecuted for these crimes. I do, William said quietly, and I accept whatever punishment you see fit. I've lived with guilt for 8 years. Prison would almost be a relief. Walk me through what happened that night, everything you remember. William closed his eyes, his voice distant. It was December 21st, 1828, cold night. Thomas Whitmore had called a meeting with my brother Henry, Samuel Carswell, and Jacob Thornton the night before. He'd found discrepancies in the church building fund money that should have been there wasn't. He'd traced it back to the 3 of them. How much money? Nearly $300. They'd been skimming it for 2 years, using it for personal expenses, gambling debts, things they couldn't explain to their families. They kept meaning to pay it back, but the debt just grew. And Thomas threatened to expose them. Worse, he threatened to report them to territorial authorities. Back then, theft of church funds was a serious crime. They could have faced prison time. Their families would have been ruined, their reputations destroyed. Crawford made notes in his ledger, so they decided to kill him. They decided to silence him, William corrected. I don't think they set out to murder a whole family, but Alina and the twins were there, and they couldn't risk leaving witnesses. Tell me exactly what happened. William's hands trembled. They came to me the afternoon of the 21st, asked if I'd help them solve a problem. I didn't understand what they meant at first. They explained that Thomas had become a threat to the entire community, that his righteousness was going to destroy everything we'd built. They convinced you it was justified. They convinced me we had no choice. That's how they framed it, no choice. Either Thomas stayed quiet or the community fell apart, and since Thomas refused to stay quiet. William opened his eyes, tears streaming down his weathered face. I provided the lamp oil, enough to soak the outside walls. Samuel built the locks for the doors and windows, special locks that could only be opened from the outside. Henry and Jacob did the actual work while the family slept. And you watched? I watched, William confirmed. God help me, I stood there and watched a cabin burn with 4 people inside. I heard them screaming, begging, and I did nothing. Why not stop it? You could have opened the door, let them out. By the time I realized the full horror of what we were doing, it was too late. The fire was too intense, and my brother, he held my arm, told me it would be over soon, that we just had to wait it out. Crawford's expression remained neutral, but Josiah could see the disgust in his eyes. What happened after? We waited until morning, let the fire burn itself out. Then we examined the remains. The bodies were badly burned, but not enough. You could still tell they hadn't died naturally. The skulls showed trauma. Jacob and Henry had knocked Thomas and Alina unconscious first, said it would be more merciful. More merciful, Crawford repeated flatly. That's what they told themselves. Jacob Thornton in particular, he couldn't handle the idea of them suffering, so he hit them first, hard enough to crack their skulls, then the fire. And the burial. We couldn't risk a proper examination. If any doctor looked at those bodies, they'd know immediately it wasn't a simple fire. So we decided to bury them temporarily while we figured out what to do long term. When we started planning the church a few months later, Jacob had the idea to incorporate the grave into the foundation, hiding the evidence beneath sacred ground. He said it was fitting, that God would forgive us if we used their sacrifice to build something holy. I think he was losing his mind by then. He started drinking heavily, having nightmares. Crawford closed his notebook. Mr. Meacham, the men you've named are all dead. You're the only one left who can face justice for these crimes. I know, but you've cooperated fully, confessed without coercion. That will be taken into account during sentencing. After William was led away by the deputies, Crawford turned his attention to Josiah and his daughters. Brother Bennett, he said, I need to understand how your daughters knew about any of this. William Meacham's confession corroborates everything they said down to specific details. The locket, the carved name, the location of the grave. How? Josiah had been dreading this question. Marshal, I've been asking myself that same question for years. I have no answer that will satisfy you. Try me. My daughters have abilities I can't explain. They see things, know things they shouldn't. It started when they were very young. At first, I thought it was just twin intuition, the kind of connection identical siblings sometimes have, but it's more than that. What exactly do they claim to see? Sarah answered before Josiah could. We see what happened, Marshal Crawford, like watching a memory that isn't ours. We feel what the people felt, hear what they heard. Sometimes they show us specific things they want people to know. They, you mean the dead? The Whitmore family showed us, Susanna said, especially Grace and Hope. They wanted people to know they didn't die in an accident, that they mattered, that they existed. Crawford studied the twins with an expression Josiah couldn't quite read. I'm a practical man, girls. I believe in evidence, facts, things I can see and touch. What you're describing sounds like. Like we're making it up, Sarah finished. We know, people usually think that. But we're not, Susanna added. We could tell you other things, things we couldn't possibly know. Would that help? Crawford exchanged a glance with Judge Walsh, who'd been observing silently. What kind of things? The twins looked at each other, then at the marshal. You have a daughter named Catherine, Sarah said. She's 12. She has your eyes but her mother's dark hair. Crawford's expression didn't change, but Josiah saw his jaw tighten slightly. Your wife died giving birth to her, Susanna continued gently. Consumption took her 3 days after the delivery. You blamed yourself because you weren't there. You were tracking outlaws in Arkansas. Catherine has your wife's wedding ring on a chain around her neck, Sarah said. She wears it every day, and she talks to her mother's portrait every night before bed. Crawford's professional mask cracked slightly. How could you possibly know that? Your wife wants you to know Catherine is going to be fine, Sarah said. She's worried that you worry too much, that you can't let go of the guilt. She says to tell you it wasn't your fault, Susanna added, that she chose to have the baby even though the doctor warned her it was dangerous. She wanted to give you a daughter. Crawford stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Excuse me, he said, his voice tight. He walked out of the church quickly. Judge Walsh looked at the twins with something between awe and fear. Did someone tell you about the Marshal's family? No, Your Honor, Josiah said. This is the first time we've met him. My daughters couldn't have known any of that through normal means. Then how? If I knew that, Judge, I'd tell you. All I know is that they're never wrong. Not once in 10 years have they revealed something that wasn't true. Walsh was quiet for a long moment. I've presided over a lot of unusual cases in my career, Brother Bennett, but this, This challenges everything I thought I understood about the world. Marshal Crawford returned about 10 minutes later, his eyes red but his composure restored. He didn't mention what the twins had said, but his attitude toward them had shifted noticeably. "All right," he said, "let's accept for the sake of argument that your daughters possess some form of extraordinary perception. The question is, what do we do with that information?" "What do you mean?" Josiah asked. "I mean legally. Can testimony obtained through supernatural means be used in a court of law? Can we prosecute William Meacham based on confessions prompted by 2 children claiming to speak with the dead?" Judge Walsh leaned forward. The confession itself is voluntary and corroborated by physical evidence. The source of the information that led to the confession is unusual, yes, but not necessarily inadmissible. "But it sets a precedent," Crawford argued. "If we allow this, we're essentially validating claims of communication with the deceased. That opens a door I'm not sure we want opened." "The door is already open, Marshal," Walsh said. "Whether we acknowledge it or not, these children have demonstrated knowledge they shouldn't possess. William Meacham confessed because he believed them. The physical evidence confirms their claims. We can't ignore that just because it makes us uncomfortable." Crawford rubbed his face wearily. "What about the other families, the ones who knew but stayed silent?" "Legally, silence isn't a crime," Walsh said. "Morally questionable, yes, but without evidence of active participation or conspiracy, we can't prosecute them. So William Meacham faces justice alone. Unless others come forward, which I doubt they will." As if summoned by those words, there was a knock at the church door. A middle-aged woman entered, her face pale but determined. "My name is Rebecca Carswell," she said. "Samuel Carswell was my father-in-law. He died 2 years ago, but before he died, he told me things about the Whitmore family, things I should have reported but didn't." Crawford pulled out his notebook again. "What did he tell you, Mrs. Carswell?" And so it began. Over the next 3 days, 5 more people came forward with pieces of the story. Confessions second-hand, deathbed admissions, fragments of overheard conversations. Each one added another layer to the picture of what had happened in 1828. It turned out that more people had known or suspected the truth than anyone had admitted, but the conspiracy of silence had been absolute, until 2 10-year-old girls arrived and made silence impossible. William Meacham's trial took place in the county seat 3 weeks after his arrest. The case attracted attention from across Mississippi and beyond. Newspapers sent reporters. Legal scholars came to observe. The courtroom was packed every day with people trying to understand how such a crime could have remained hidden for so long. The prosecution presented the physical evidence, the bones showing trauma, the locket, the carved floorboard with Grace's desperate message. Dr. Hayes testified about his examination of the remains. Rebecca Carswell and others testified about confessions they'd heard over the years. And Marshal Crawford testified about William Meacham's full confession. The defense didn't dispute the facts. William's lawyer, a young man from Natchez who'd taken the case out of a sense of duty, argued for mercy based on his client's age, his genuine remorse, and his cooperation with authorities. But the moment everyone was waiting for came when the prosecution called Sarah and Susanna Bennett to testify. Judge Walsh had debated whether to allow it. Children rarely testified in court, and the nature of their knowledge was unprecedented. But ultimately, he decided their testimony was relevant to understanding how the crime had been discovered. Josiah sat in the gallery, his hands clasped tightly as his daughters were sworn in. They stood together, identical in their simple dresses, their hands finding each other automatically. The prosecutor, a stern man named Douglas Price, approached them gently. "Miss Sarah, Miss Susanna, can you tell the court how you first learned about the Whitmore family?" "We dreamed about them," Sarah said clearly, "a few days before we arrived in Hebron Springs." "What did you dream?" "We saw a cabin burning," Susanna said. "We saw a family trapped inside. We felt their fear." "And you believed these dreams were real, not just nightmares?" The twins nodded. "Our dreams are different from other people's dreams," Sarah explained. "They show us things that really happened." "How did you know they're real?" "Because they're always true," Susanna said simply. "Everything we've ever seen in our dreams, when we tell people about it, it turns out to be real." Price walked them through the details of their arrival in Hebron Springs, their dreams about the Whitmore family, and the specific information they'd shared that led to the excavation. The defense attorney cross-examined carefully. "Miss Sarah, you say you saw these events in dreams. But you weren't alive in 1828, were you? No, sir. So you couldn't have witnessed the fire directly? No, sir. Then how can you be certain what you saw was accurate? Sarah tilted her head thoughtfully. How can you be certain what you remember from yesterday is accurate? Memory is just images in your mind. Our dreams are the same, except they're images from other people's memories. Other people? You mean the deceased Whitmore family? Yes, sir. So you're claiming to communicate with dead people? Not exactly communicate, Susanna interjected. It's more like, they show us things, important things they want people to know. We don't have conversations with them. We just receive impressions, images, feelings. The defense attorney looked frustrated. Your Honor, this testimony is highly irregular. We're being asked to accept that these children receive information from beyond the grave. The source of their information is unusual, Judge Walsh agreed, but the accuracy is undeniable. Every fact they've stated has been corroborated by physical evidence or confession. The court will allow the testimony to stand. After the twins finished, William Meacham himself took the stand. His lawyer had advised against it, but William insisted. I need to tell them myself, he'd said. I need to look those girls in the eye and admit what I did. He recounted the entire story again, filling in details he'd remembered since his initial confession. The planning, the execution, the years of guilt. Why didn't you confess before? The prosecutor asked. Fear, William said honestly. Fear of punishment, fear of my family's shame, fear of losing everything I'd built on that terrible foundation. What changed? William looked at Sarah and Susanna, who sat quietly in the gallery beside their father. Those children changed everything. They came to Hebron Springs and spoke truths that no living person should know, and I realized that God wasn't going to let this secret stay buried forever. Do you believe they truly communicated with the Whitmore family? I don't know what I believe about how they knew, William said, but I believe they're telling the truth. Every word they spoke was accurate. Every detail they revealed was correct. Whether that knowledge came from God, from the dead, or from some ability science can't explain doesn't matter. What matters is that they brought justice to a family that deserved it. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty of accessory to murder, 4 counts. Judge Walsh sentenced William Meacham to 15 years in prison, with consideration given for his age and cooperation. It was a harsh sentence for a 76-year-old man. Everyone in the courtroom knew he'd likely die in prison. But William accepted it with quiet dignity. I deserve worse, he said when asked if he had anything to say before sentencing. I helped murder a family. 4 innocent people died because we valued money more than lives. No sentence could be harsh enough. After the verdict, Josiah and his daughters prepared to leave the county seat. They'd been there for 3 weeks, longer than they'd ever stayed anywhere, but Josiah knew it was time to move on. Marshal Crawford found them as they were packing. Brother Bennett, he said, I wanted to thank you and apologize. Apologize for what? For doubting your daughters, for not believing them immediately. He looked at Sarah and Susanna. What you girls did here, it took courage. You told a truth that an entire community wanted to stay hidden. You gave a family justice when everyone else had failed them. We just told people what we saw, Sarah said softly. Will you keep traveling? Crawford asked Josiah. That's the plan, unless you're going to arrest my daughters for witchcraft or something. Crawford smiled slightly. No, I'm not going to do that, but I will say this, there are a lot of unsolved cases in Mississippi. A lot of families who never got justice. If your daughters are willing, their abilities could help a lot of people. We'll think about it, Josiah said carefully, but for now we need some time to rest. This has been hard on them. It was true, the twins had been exhausted by the trial, drained by having to relive the Whitmore family's final moments over and over as they testified. They needed peace. As they walked out of the courthouse, a woman approached them. She was in her 60s, with white hair and kind eyes. Excuse me, she said, are you the Bennett twins? Sarah and Susanna nodded. My name is Catherine Whitmore, the woman said. I'm Thomas Whitmore's aunt, his father's sister. She knelt down so she was eye level with the girls. I want to thank you for 8 years. My family has wondered what really happened to Thomas and Alina and those beautiful little girls. We were told it was an accident, but it never felt right. Now, finally, we know the truth. We're sorry it took so long, Susanna said. Don't be sorry, be proud. You gave my nephew's family their voices back. You made sure they won't be forgotten. She pressed something into Sarah's hand. It was a small silver button, tarnished with age. "This was from Thomas's wedding vest," she said. "I kept it all these years. I want you to have it, so you remember that the people you helped were real. They had lives, families, people who loved them." Sarah looked at the button, then at the woman. "Thomas was a good man," she said softly. "He just wanted to do the right thing." "He was," Catherine agreed, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for knowing that." Hebron Springs never recovered from the scandal. Within a year, half the families had moved away, unable to bear the shame of what had happened in their community. The church was torn down completely. Nobody wanted to worship in a building constructed over a grave site. The Whitmore family was reburied properly in a new cemetery, with a large marble headstone that told their true story. Catherine Whitmore paid for it personally, making sure future generations would know what happened to them. Reverend Marcus Thornton left the ministry entirely. He moved to New Orleans and became a school teacher, dedicating his life to educating children about honesty and moral courage. He never married, never had children of his own. Some said he was atoning for his father's sins. Dr. Hayes wrote a detailed medical paper about the case, including his examination of the remains and his observations of the Bennett twins. The paper was published in several medical journals and sparked heated debate about the nature of consciousness and the possibility of perception beyond normal sensory limits. But no one could explain how Sarah and Susanna knew what they knew. Josiah and his daughters continued their travels, but the Hebron Springs case had changed them. Word spread quickly about what had happened. Some communities begged them to visit, hoping they could solve long-standing mysteries. Others banned them entirely, afraid of what secrets might be revealed. The twins themselves struggled with the burden of their abilities. "Papa," Sarah said one night as they camped under the stars somewhere in Alabama, "do you think we're cursed?" "Why would you think that?" "Because everywhere we go, we bring pain. We reveal things that hurt people. We destroy communities." Josiah pulled both girls close. "You don't destroy anything, sweetheart. You bring truth to light. And yes, sometimes truth is painful, but it's also necessary." "The Whitmore family needed justice," Susanna said quietly. "We gave them that." "You did, and who knows how many other families need the same thing. How many other Grace Whitmores are out there, desperate for someone to hear them." "But it's so hard, Papa. We feel everything they felt. The fear, the pain, the betrayal." "I know, and I wish I could take that burden from you. But maybe that's why you were given this gift, because you're strong enough to bear it." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother used to say, the truth might hurt, but lies hurt worse. Do you think that's true?" Josiah smiled. His wife's mother had indeed said that often. "I think it is, sweetheart. Lies hurt worse because they never heal properly, like a wound that gets infected because you don't clean it out." "The truth is the cleaning," Susanna said thoughtfully. "Exactly." In the years that followed, the Bennett twins helped solve dozens of cases. Missing persons found, murders revealed, injustices exposed. Their methods were never fully accepted by mainstream society, too strange, too unexplainable, but their accuracy was undeniable. Marshall Crawford kept in touch with the family. He'd send letters when he encountered cases that seemed particularly suited to the twins' abilities. Josiah would read the letters, discuss them with his daughters, and they'd decide together whether to get involved. They didn't take every case. Some secrets, they decided, were better left buried. Some truths would do more harm than good. But when they did choose to help, they were thorough, methodical, and always accurate. The medical and scientific communities remained baffled. Dr. Hayes corresponded with researchers across the country, trying to understand the twins' abilities. Theories ranged from heightened intuition to some form of telepathy to actual communication with the deceased, but none could be proven. The girls were examined by doctors, questioned by scientists, tested by skeptics, but they always passed. They always knew things they shouldn't know, and they could never explain how. "It's just what we see," they'd say. "Like you see colors or hear sounds, we see what happened." Some researchers theorized it was a form of photographic memory combined with exceptional observational skills, that the twins noticed tiny details others missed and constructed accurate scenarios from minimal information. But that theory fell apart when they described events that occurred in completely isolated situations with no witnesses, when they knew things that existed only in dead people's memories. In 1842, when the twins were 16, they abruptly stopped demonstrating their abilities publicly. Josiah never explained why. He simply stopped accepting Marshall Crawford's letters, stopped traveling to crime scenes. They settled in a small town in Tennessee, and the girls lived quiet, normal lives. Some speculated that the abilities had faded as the girls matured. Others thought Josiah had forbidden them from using their gifts. A few dark rumors suggested something terrible had happened, that the twins had seen something they couldn't bear to live with. The truth was simpler and sadder. Sarah and Susanna had grown tired of carrying other people's pain, tired of reliving tragedies, tired of being feared and questioned and treated like curiosities instead of people. They wanted normal lives, marriages, children, homes, the simple pleasures that everyone else took for granted. Josiah supported their decision completely. "You've given enough," he told them. "You've helped more people than anyone could ask. Now it's time to live for yourselves." Both girls married local men who loved them for who they were, not for what they could do. Sarah had 4 children. Susanna had 3. They lived next door to each other and grew old together, finishing each other's sentences and sharing that special twin connection. But they never spoke publicly about their abilities again. When researchers tried to contact them, they politely declined. When Marshall Crawford wrote asking for help with one more case, they kindly refused. That chapter of their lives was closed. Josiah Bennett died in 1851 at the age of 49. Both daughters were at his bedside. His last words, according to family legend, were, "You made me proud every single day, not because of your gift, but because of how you used it, with compassion, with courage, with love." Sarah and Susanna lived into their 70s, dying within 6 months of each other in 1898. Their children and grandchildren buried them side by side in a quiet cemetery in Tennessee, their matching headstones simple and dignified. The headstones didn't mention their abilities, didn't reference the mysteries they'd solved or the justice they'd brought to forgotten victims. Just their names, dates, and a single phrase: beloved mothers, faithful servants of truth. But the stories didn't die with them. Their children spoke about the Hebron Springs case to their own children, about how their mothers, at just 10 years old, had exposed a murder that an entire community had conspired to hide, about the impossible knowledge they'd possessed and the courage it took to speak it aloud. The story was passed down through generations, growing more embellished with each telling. Some versions claimed the twins could raise the dead, others said they could see the future, a few even suggested they were angels in human form. But the core truth remained consistent. Sarah and Susanna Bennett had known things they couldn't possibly know, and they'd used that knowledge to give voice to the voiceless. The Hebron Springs case remained in legal records as one of the most unusual murder investigations in Mississippi history. Law students studied it, psychologists analyzed it, skeptics tried to debunk it, believers held it up as proof of life after death. But nobody could explain it. In 1954, when Reverend Thornton's journals were discovered during the demolition of his great-grandson's house, they provided even more documentation of the twins' impossible accuracy. Thornton had recorded every statement they made, every detail they revealed, with meticulous precision. And every single detail had been proven true. The journals were donated to the Mississippi State Archives, where they remain available to researchers today. Alongside them are Dr. Hayes' medical reports, Marshall Crawford's investigation files, and trial transcripts from William Meacham's prosecution. The evidence is undeniable, verifiable, real. 2 10-year-old girls revealed secrets about a crime committed 8 years before their birth, in a place they'd never been, involving people they'd never met, and everything they said was accurate down to the smallest detail. Modern psychologists have studied the case extensively. Dr. Patricia Morrison, no relation to the twins' married name, published a comprehensive analysis in 1987 titled The Bennett Twins, a case study in unexplained perception. She examined every piece of available evidence, interviewed descendants of everyone involved, and consulted with experts in fields ranging from neuroscience to parapsychology. Her conclusion, whatever enabled Sarah and Susanna Bennett to access information about the Whitmore murders remains beyond our current scientific understanding. The accuracy of their knowledge cannot be explained through conventional means. Whether we classify this as extrasensory perception, some form of psychic ability, or an as yet undiscovered function of human consciousness, the fact remains that they knew things they should not have known. Other researchers proposed alternative theories. Some suggested the twins had somehow accessed residual memories embedded in physical locations, that traumatic events could leave psychic imprints that sensitive individuals could perceive. This stone tape theory attempted to explain how the girls could know details about events that occurred before their birth. Others argued for quantum consciousness theories, suggesting that information might exist in non-local states that certain minds could access under specific conditions. A few researchers proposed that William Meacham or other conspirators had deliberately leaked information to the twins, using them as cover to assuage guilty consciences without directly confessing. But this theory fell apart under scrutiny, too many specific details, known only to the dead, for any living person to have provided. The most skeptical researchers claimed it was all an elaborate hoax, that Josiah Bennett had researched the Whitmore case extensively before arriving in Hebron Springs, fed his daughters the information, and coached them to deliver it convincingly. But this theory couldn't explain how Josiah would have obtained information that wasn't in any public record. The locket, Grace's carved message, the specific burial location, these details existed only in the memories of the guilty conspirators. And it didn't explain the hundreds of other cases where the twins demonstrated similar abilities in places Josiah couldn't possibly have researched in advance. The truth remained frustratingly elusive, real, documented, verified, and completely inexplicable. What exactly were Sarah and Susanna Bennett? Were they psychics, mediums, people with some form of enhanced perception science hasn't yet discovered? Or were they exactly what they claimed to be ordinary girls who happened to receive